Hello, I'm Elise Vance, the author of the channel Borrowed Lives, and I offer you fascinating stories. Like and subscribe to my channel.
The morning light hit the empty studio first. It wasn't vacant because a tragedy had claimed my daughter. It was empty because I had walked away. The workspace was silent. The potter's wheel sat motionless near the terrace doors. The hand-knit sweaters were gone. The organic baby jars had vanished. The wooden developmental toys had been cleared from the shelves. Taped directly to the glass of the display cabinet was a single index card. For words, "Best of luck, Julian." That was the exact moment he realized I hadn't been bluffing. The ironic part was that barely 9 hours earlier, he had been standing there with a smug grin, completely unbothered, while he dismantled our relationship. It was 1:30 a.m. I was sitting in the corner of our loft in downtown Denver, cradling my 4-month-old daughter, Maya. The industrial space was dark except for the amber glow of a small desk lamp. I had been up for over an hour. At 48 years old, I certainly wasn't physically primed for the brutal sleep schedule of an infant. But life has a strange way of rewriting your plans. After years of assuming motherhood was a closed chapter, my husband and I had taken emergency custody of Maya following a devastating accident involving my late younger sister. She wasn't mine by blood. But from the moment I held her fragile frame, she became my entire world. My doctors had explicitly warned me that caring for a newborn at this stage in my life would take an immense physical toll. They were right. My joints ached and my eyes burned. Yet, I cherished every single minute. The soft sighs, the tiny fists gripping my collar, the way her breathing synchronized with mine the second I lifted her. Those moments gave me an absolute, unshakable purpose. The heavy sound of the elevator doors opening in the hallway shattered the quiet. I glanced toward the entry. Julian was finally back. Again. For the past 5 months, his return times had pushed deeper into the night. Late-night client pitch meetings, emergency board dinners, structural consultations. That was the official story anyway. He was an architect, so long hours weren't unusual, but the underlying truth had become painfully glaring. The expensive cologne that wasn't his usual brand, the encrypted messaging apps, the sudden obsession with bespoke suits, the urgent weekend trips to the coast. Turning 55 had triggered something in him. Or perhaps it had simply stripped away his mask. I heard his footsteps echo across the concrete floor. A moment later, Julian appeared in the frame of the nursery doorway. His salt and pepper hair was disheveled. His linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. And even across the 10-foot gap, I caught the unmistakable scent of jasmine perfume. Not mine. Never mine. He leaned casually against the frame and let out a faint, patronizing smile. Not a guilty look. Not a hesitant one. The look of a man convinced he held all the cards. "Still up?" he asked, his voice smooth. I looked down at Maya. Someone has to keep her routine. Julian let out a dry, quiet chuckle. It was cold. He stepped into the room and carelessly tossed his luxury watch onto the changing table, crossing his arms over his chest. "You know," he murmured. I kept my eyes fixed on the baby and didn't offer a response. "My head designer is incredible," he said smoothly. There it was. No hesitation, no attempt to cover his tracks or offer a diplomatic lie. I felt a sharp knot twist in my stomach, but my voice stayed trapped inside. Julian seemed almost disappointed by my lack of an emotional outburst, so he leaned in slightly. I spent the evening at her apartment. The air in the room instantly turned ice cold. Maya shifted slightly in my arms, and I gently readjusted her swaddle. Julian paused, watching me intently, hoping I'd throw something, hoping I'd burst into tears, hoping I'd beg him to reconsider. Instead, I just stared quietly at my daughter. Julian's grin broadened. And I have no intention of stopping. The words hung heavy in the silence. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Finally, he gave a slow shake of his head. "You don't even have the energy to care, do you?" I raised my head and looked at him. Truly looked at him. The man I had spent a decade building a life with. The man who had sworn to be my partner through every hurdle. The man who now smelled like a high-end boutique department store. And unexpectedly, a profound, steady calm washed over me. No panic. No screaming. Just crystal clarity. I gave a single, quiet nod. Understood. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Not much, but enough to notice. It wasn't the dramatic scene he had scripted in his mind. He wanted a fight to justify his actions. Instead, I offered zero resistance. It threw him off balance. "That's all you've got to say?" he pressed, narrowing his eyes. "That's all." He held my gaze for another beat, then dismissively shrugged his shoulders. "Have it your way." A minute later, his heavy footsteps faded down the gallery hallway. I heard the sound of the audio system turning on in the living room, followed by low music. Then silence. Maya had finished her milk. I gently lifted her against my collarbone, and she let out a tiny soft burp. A quiet smile touched my lips despite the chaos outside the room. "Good job, little one." For the next hour, I sat motionless in the rocking chair, analyzing every detail, remembering every red flag, and formulating a strategy. The truth was, Julian's cruel confession hadn't caught me completely unprepared. What surprised me was how effortlessly he had simplified my next steps. Months earlier, I had started spotting discrepancies. Unexplained credit card charges, unusual bank withdrawals, missing funds from our joint venture accounts. At first, I tried to convince myself there were reasonable business explanations. Then, I began silently saving records, just in case. A former senior archivist at a university research facility learns early on that paper trails are everything. And I documented every single detail. Every digital receipt, every monthly statement, every irregular wire transfer. Without Julian's knowledge, I had consulted a top-tier family law attorney. Without Julian's knowledge, I had secured specific personal assets. Without Julian's knowledge, I had quietly prepared for the exact moment I would need to walk away. That moment had arrived. At 3:15 a.m., I carried Maya into my dressing room. I packed 2 large duffel bags, infant clothes, formula, medical history folders, original family photos, crucial identity documents, and essential gear. Nothing non-essential. At 4 a.m., I quietly bolted the master suite door from the inside. Not out of fear, but because I refused to tolerate any dramatic interruptions. Julian had fallen asleep on the leather sofa in the lounge, or perhaps he had passed out from the wine. I didn't care either way. Just as the sky began to turn pale gray, I secured Maya into her rear-facing car seat. I took one final walk through the loft space. The open kitchen where we had hosted lavish gallery dinners, the polished concrete floors, the balcony overlooking the city skyline, 10 years of shared history, entirely closed out. At exactly 5:47 a.m., I carried my daughter down the service elevator to the garage. The cool morning air hit my face like cold water. For the first time in nearly a year, my chest felt light. I secured Maya into the back of my SUV, turned the key, and pulled out onto the empty street. 10 minutes later, I placed a call on speaker. The attorney answered on the 3rd ring. "Nora." I glanced into the rearview mirror. Maya was sound asleep. "Execute the plan," I said firmly. There was a brief silence on the line. Then he replied in a steady voice, "I'm submitting the filings today." As the morning sun hit the highway ahead of me, I pressed on the accelerator. I didn't know every detail of what lay ahead, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Julian had made the single biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea what was coming next. By 7:30 that morning, I was standing in the gravel driveway of a small timber frame cottage on the shores of Lake Champlain in Vermont. I held Maya close to my chest as a crisp, damp breeze blew across the water. The cottage had belonged to my godmother, Eleanor. She was an independent, vibrant woman who drove vintage sports cars and never sought anyone's permission to live life on her own terms. When she passed, she left the property to me along with a short, handwritten note, "For the day you stop compromising your light." At the time, I thought it was just a poetic gesture. Standing there in the morning mist, the true meaning was crystal clear. The cottage wasn't grand. The front porch had a slight sag on the east side, the kitchen smelled of cedar wood, and the guest room faucet had a tiny leak I hadn't yet repaired. But it was private, safe, and entirely mine. I brought Maya inside, laid her on an antique quilt, and warmed her milk using a small saucepan since I hadn't packed an electric warmer. While she drank, I sat at Eleanor's heavy pine table and unlocked my phone. Julian had attempted to call 17 times. Then the messages started pouring in. "Where are you? This isn't funny, Nora. Bring her back immediately. You can't just take the child." That last sentence actually made me chuckle. For months, Julian had treated Maya like an inconvenient accessory, too noisy, too demanding, an interruption to his lifestyle. Now, suddenly, he was claiming parental outrage. I ignored every single notification. At 8:10 a.m., my attorney, Marcus Vance, called back. Marcus was 68, incredibly sharp, and still wore sharp tailored three-piece suits even though his firm had moved to modern glass offices years ago. He had overseen Eleanor's estate transactions and knew the precise financial layout of my situation. "Are you secure?" He opened immediately. "Yes." "And the baby?" "Sleeping peacefully." "Good." "Pay close attention, Nora," Marcus said calmly. "Do not return to the property under any circumstances without me or an officer present. Do not engage in text arguments with him. Save every single line." "I'm archiving everything in real time," I answered. I expected nothing less. He gave a soft chuckle. "Archivists don't leave loose ends. It's your greatest asset." His words grounded me. It was a firm reminder that I was far from powerless. I had spent over 2 decades meticulously cataloging and managing complex institutional records. I knew how to track paper, identify anomalies, and spot when an entry didn't add up. And Julian, in his arrogance, had vastly underestimated that skill set. 3 months before I left, I had uncovered the first discrepancy: a corporate credit card account under an unfamiliar LLC name. The initial charges were modest: upscale business lunches, boutique hotels in Aspen, luxury jewelry stores. Then came larger, sweeping transfers: a retreat in Miami, custom designer wardrobes, high-end spa resort packages, all routed through a defunct firm Julian had claimed was liquidated 2 years prior. When I had casually inquired about the account structure back then, he had simply smiled, patted my shoulder, and said, "Nora, darling, don't strain yourself worrying about accounting details." That condescending remark was the exact moment I began quietly investigating. I made digital copies. I scanned bank slips. I captured metadata from encrypted emails before he wiped his devices. I cross-referenced older tax schedules, capital distribution logs, and architectural partnership files he had stored in locked fireproof boxes in the basement office. What I uncovered wasn't just an extramarital affair. It was a calculated pattern of financial diversion. Julian had been siphoning assets. Some from our shared investment portfolio, some from a business liquidating account, and some from a private educational trust fund Eleanor had created specifically for my personal security and family expenses. He had no legal authority to move those assets. But Julian had always operated under the assumption that rules were meant for ordinary people, not someone of his stature. Marcus had warned me weeks prior: the second he takes one step too far, we trigger the filings. At 2 a.m., Julian hadn't just crossed the line, he had obliterated it. By noon, Marcus had filed emergency petitions in court. By 2 p.m., all primary joint holding accounts were officially flagged for audit. By 4 p.m., Julian's authorization to access specific capital funds was temporarily suspended pending formal judicial review. I knew the exact minute the notices hit his desk because my phone lit up continuously. "What the hell did you just do? Pick up now. You have no idea what kind of mess you've started." And then, hours later, "Nora, please. We need to handle this like rational adults." I stared at the screen for a long time. Rational adults. He hadn't wanted to act like a rational adult when he walked into our home smelling of another woman's perfume. He hadn't cared about being rational when he tried to demean me while I was feeding our daughter in the dark. But accountability has a remarkable way of forcing immediate politeness. That evening, I sat on the cottage porch, cradling Maya wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Across the narrow road, my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, gave a friendly wave from her garden gate. She was well into her late 70s, with silver hair tied back and a faded flannel jacket. Planning on staying through the autumn, Nora? She called out across the lawn. I think we are, I replied, raising my voice over the lake breeze. She gave a slow, knowing nod. Good. The water has a way of clearing a person's head. For the first time in months, I felt like she was entirely right. 2 days later, Marcus called my cell again. This time, his tone was different, sharp, precise, and completely focused. Nora, he began, we've uncovered a critical signature. I tightened my grip on the phone. Julian's. No, Marcus said carefully. The design director's. My stomach dropped. What did she sign? She signed as an authorized corporate agent on a series of capital transfer forms linked to Julian's offshore holding account. Marcus paused to let the information settle. It means she wasn't just a partner in his personal life. It appears she actively assisted in rerouting funds that were legally tied to your marital estate. I looked over at the wooden bassinet where Maya was sleeping soundly. What are the legal implications? It means her personal and professional liability is now directly tied to his, Marcus said plainly. And the financial court does not take kindly to hidden assets. Outside, heavy slate-gray clouds rolled over Lake Champlain. For a brief second, Julian's voice echoed in my memory. My head designer is incredible. Perhaps she was. But her signature was now on official financial disclosures. And official disclosures, unlike charm, cannot be talked away. 3 weeks after I left the city loft, Julian lost his head designer. Not because he suddenly developed a conscience, not because he realized the error of his ways, and certainly not because he missed the family he had discarded. She left the moment the corporate accounts were frozen and the legal inquiries started arriving at her desk. It's remarkable how fast romance evaporates when subpoenas and asset freezes replace luxury dinners. I learned about it later through Marcus. At the time, I was simply sitting on the porch watching a late summer thunderstorm sweep across the lake. The sky was a deep indigo, waves crashed against the shoreline, and a deep sense of stillness settled over me. My new reality wasn't effortless, far from it. At 48, managing a baby on broken sleep meant my body constantly felt the strain. My back throbbed on cold mornings, and there were nights Maya cried endlessly from teething discomfort. But every challenge felt honest. There were no hidden motives, no deceit, no strange cologne on forgotten shirts, just me and my daughter, building a life from scratch. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable walked up the steps holding a hot casserole dish. No mother caring for an infant should have to cook every evening, she insisted gently. The following week, another neighbor stopped by with fresh produce. An elderly carpenter from down the lane fixed the porch's sagging step without asking for a dime. Without planning it, a quiet community began forming around us, not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness. Meanwhile, Julian's world was rapidly unraveling. Marcus phoned regularly with updates, each report painting a grimmer picture than the last. His firm's primary partners are conducting an internal review, Marcus shared during one call. What kind of review? The kind that happens when equity partners discover undocumented capital withdrawals. I rocked Maya gently. What happens to him now? Now, the auditors do their job. And once auditors begin pulling threads, the entire tapestry unravels. They uncovered unauthorized transfers, improper expense reports, and funds shuffled between personal and business entities without legal backing. It wasn't the dramatic stuff of television thrillers, but it was more than enough to dismantle a career, destroy professional trust, and bring severe financial penalties. Julian had spent 25 years carefully crafting a reputation as an elite architect. Now, that reputation was splintering. The designer's involvement made matters far worse. Whether she fully understood what she was signing was irrelevant. Her name was on the documents, and panic had clearly set in. A month after my departure, Julian's combative messages stopped completely. The tone of his communications shifted dramatically. First came anger, then confusion, and finally desperation. A text arrived at 1 a.m. one night. I made catastrophic mistakes. Another followed 2 days later. Can we please sit down and talk? And finally, Nora, please don't do this to us. I never typed a single reply. Not out of malice, but because there was simply nothing left to discuss. Reality was doing all the speaking for me. Roughly 6 weeks after moving to Vermont, Marcus invited me to his office in Burlington. Maya sat contentedly in her stroller, while Marcus spread several thick financial files across his desk. He adjusted his reading glasses and let out a quiet sigh. Julian's primary retirement distributions have been officially placed under judicial hold, he said. I blinked. Completely? Pending a full accounting review, Marcus corrected. It's severe enough that he's currently liquidating personal property just to cover legal retainers. For a brief moment, I remembered the man I had married a decade ago, the man who had spent an entire summer building a garden gazebo for my family, the man who brought me tea every rain-soaked morning. That version of Julian felt like a ghost. What about the designer? I asked quietly. Marcus offered a sad smile. She resigned from the firm and hired her own defense attorney. She left him. The moment she realized the grand future he promised was built on borrowed capital, Marcus said softly. I looked down at Maya, who was peacefully sleeping, completely shielded from the chaos surrounding her father's choices. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair. Nora, in my 40 years of practicing law, I've learned that affairs are almost entirely built on fantasy. When reality crashes in, the fantasy vanishes instantly. I pondered his words all the way back to the cottage. Fantasy. Julian had wanted to feel invincible again. He wanted admiration, youth, and an escape from aging. He wasn't the first middle-aged man to make that tragic trade, and he wouldn't be the last. The fatal flaw with fantasy is that it always collides with truth. And truth never loses. Autumn fully settled over the lake. The dense forest surrounding the water exploded into shades of burnt orange, deep red, and gold. Maya grew stronger with every passing week. Her first genuine laugh happened when I accidentally dropped a wooden spoon while making oatmeal. The unexpected noise startled her, and then she burst into a fit of tiny giggles. I laughed so hard my eyes swelled with tears. Moments like that healed pieces of me I didn't even realize were broken. One rainy Thursday afternoon, while I was folding small sweaters in the living room, a heavy knock sounded at the front door. 3 slow, hesitant thuds. Not a neighbor. Not Mrs. Gable. Not the postal carrier. My stomach knotted. I stood up slowly as rain tapped against the glass panes. Maya was resting peacefully in her cradle. I walked to the entrance and peered through the window pane. For a second, I barely recognized the man standing on the porch. Julian looked diminished. His shoulders slumped inside an overpriced coat that now looked ill-fitting. The sharp, untouchable arrogance was entirely gone. Standing under the dripping eaves, he looked a decade older. The confident architect who had stood in our nursery bragging about his affair had completely vanished. In his place stood someone exhausted, defeated, and forced to face the wreckage of his own design. I rested my palm against the cool brass doorknob. Neither of us moved for a long moment. Then Julian raised his head and met my eyes through the glass. And for the very first time, I saw something genuine in his expression, deep, overwhelming regret. I opened the door. Not out of nostalgia, and not because I missed him, but because after 10 years together, I believed he deserved one chance to speak without pretense. Step inside, I said quietly. His shoulders dropped slightly in relief. Thank you, Nora. The cottage suddenly felt crowded as he crossed the threshold. Julian glanced around at the aged floorboards, the simple wooden furniture, the wool throw draped over the armchair, and the crib near the hearth. Finally, his eyes rested on Maya. Our daughter was asleep, her small fist resting against her cheek. Julian stared at her for a long time, his face softening, before he looked away. I gestured toward a kitchen chair. Sit down. He sat carefully, looking entirely out of place. I poured hot tea into 2 mugs, placing one in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic, and then, without warning, he broke down. Not a dramatic scene, but quiet, shuddering tears, the kind born from total burnout and self-inflicted ruin. I waited silently until he wiped his eyes. I don't even know where to begin, he whispered. Start with the truth. He gave a slow nod. The affair, it was a disaster. A terrible mistake. I remained quiet. That sentence was far too small for the weight of what he had done. Julian seemed to realize it. It wasn't just her, he admitted, looking toward the rain-slicked window. I retired from the university board and suddenly lost my sense of identity. My phone stopped ringing. No one was seeking my approval anymore. My assistant. She made me feel powerful again. There it was. Not profound passion. Vanity. The oldest, most predictable narrative. A man terrified of aging and becoming irrelevance, chasing validation and burning down his own foundation in the process. I convinced myself I was entitled to excitement, Julian muttered, rubbing his face. You were entitled to search for fulfillment, I said calmly. You just confused excitement with real value. His eyes filled with tears again because the truth hit home. He had traded a loyal wife, a growing daughter, and a lifetime of trust for a temporary ego boost. He looked back toward Maya's crib. I never actually believed you would walk away. I know, I said softly. You assumed my patience was infinite. 3 hours later, he prepared to leave. Before stepping out into the rain, he stood beside the cradle and whispered a quiet, trembling apology to our daughter. The following week, Julian called, not to demand terms, but to ask permission. May I visit her? Marcus urged caution. Mrs. Gable urged caution. My own instincts urged caution. But Maya deserved something better than a lifetime of bitterness. She deserved a father if he was truly willing to show up. 1 hour, I permitted. Here at the cottage. That first visit was painfully awkward. Julian arrived carrying a stuffed plush bear that was far too large. He didn't know how to hold Maya properly, how to support her back, or how to prepare her bottle. He knew almost nothing because he hadn't been present. Watching him struggle wasn't satisfying. It was simply sad, a father learning basics months too late. But he returned the next week. And the week after. Within 2 months, Julian could handle feedings, soothe her through teething, and put her to sleep. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him sitting in Eleanor's old rocking chair with Maya fast asleep against his chest. He was staring down at her with quiet awe. It didn't undo his betrayal, but it proved something vital. People can fail miserably and still choose to rebuild their character. 5 years later, the legal divisions and financial audits were long settled. Julian had taken full responsibility for his financial misconduct and settled his liabilities. The consequences remained, but the anger had evaporated. The little cottage on Lake Champlain became our permanent home. The porch was fully repaired, and garden beds flourished every spring. Julian eventually moved into a small house 10 minutes down the road, not to reconcile our marriage, but to be an active, present father. For years, he showed up reliably for every doctor checkup, every milestone, every rainy afternoon. Through thousands of quiet, consistent choices, forgiveness eventually arrived, not as a sudden wave, but as a peaceful stillness. One summer evening, while Maya was playing near the shoreline, Julian and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. I still wonder why you let me back into her life, he said quietly. I looked out over the glowing water and smiled. I didn't do it for you, Julian. I did it for Maya. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening, fully understanding the truth of it. Everything we rebuilt was for our daughter. Looking back, I don't view my story as a tale of bitter revenge. It was a story about choices. One selfish choice can shatter a family, but choosing dignity, documentation, and peace can construct a far better future than the one you lost. Someone else's worst decision never has to be the final chapter of your life. Peace is always possible on the other side.